There is a house at the end of a long dirt road in coastal Massachusetts that has been standing since 1687. It is not famous, it is not on any tour. No historical marker sits at the end of that road pointing travelers toward it. It is simply there, the way it has always been there, weathered to a gray that is almost the color of the winter sky behind it, its roofline steep and uncompromising, its windows small and deliberate, its proportions so particular and so specific that you could not mistake it for a house built in any other time or any other place. If you stood in front of that house and looked at it carefully, really carefully, for long enough, you would begin to notice something. Every decision that was made in building it was made for a reason, not an aesthetic reason, not a reason of fashion or preference or the kind of personal taste that drives the choices people make about their homes today, a reason of survival, of physics, of climate, of the particular and unforgiving reality of living on the northeastern edge of North America in the 17th century, in a landscape that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, with winters that arrived without apology and stayed as long as they liked. That house is a solution. Every line of it, every angle, every timber and shingle and carefully placed window is the answer to a problem that the people who built it understood in their bones. This is the story of those solutions, of the architectural logic that shaped the homes of New England during the colonial period, and of how that logic was not invented, but evolved, slowly and carefully through decades of trial and cold and hard-won understanding about what it takes to keep a family warm and dry and alive in a place that does not make any of those things easy. To understand New England colonial architecture, you have to understand New England. Not the New England of fall foliage and charming town squares and white-steepled churches that appears on calendars and in travel magazines. The New England that the first English settlers encountered when they arrived in the early 17th century was something considerably more demanding than that. The climate was the first surprise, and for many of the earliest arrivals, it was a brutal one. England, warmed by the Gulf Stream, has a maritime climate that is wet and gray, but rarely extreme. Temperatures in England seldom drop far below freezing, and snow, when it comes, is typically modest and temporary. The winters of coastal Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Maine are a different proposition entirely. Cold that arrives in November and does not fully release its grip until April. Snowfall measured not in inches, but in feet. Wind off the North Atlantic that finds every gap in a wall or a window frame with the patience and persistence of something that has been doing this for a long time. The summers, by contrast, are warm and humid, with heat that builds slowly through July and August, and can be, in inland areas away from the moderating influence of the ocean, surprisingly fierce. This range from the deep cold of a New England winter to the warmth of a New England summer was the primary climatic reality that every house builder in the region had to address, and the way they addressed it over the course of the 17th century and into the 18th produced a set of architectural forms that are immediately recognizable as distinctly, specifically, unmistakably New England. The people who built the first houses in New England were not, for the most part, professional architects or trained builders. They were farmers and craftsmen and tradespeople, men who had grown up in English villages and towns, who understood English building traditions and English materials and English ways of doing things. When they arrived in a new land and needed shelter, they built what they knew. The very first shelters, raised in desperate haste in the early years of settlement, were often simple dugouts or rough structures of whatever materials came most readily to hand. The Pilgrims at Plymouth in the winter of 1620 to 1621, weakened by the crossing and overwhelmed by the scale of what they had undertaken, built shelters that were, by any standard, inadequate for a New England winter. The death toll of that first winter, nearly half the colonists, was not entirely the result of inadequate housing, but inadequate housing was part of it. The survivors learned, and what they learned, they built into the houses that came after.
The English building tradition that the colonists brought with them was primarily based on a timber frame construction technique that had been developed over centuries in the forests of England. The essential structure was a heavy frame of large timbers joined at corners and intersections by mortise and tenon joints, with the spaces between the timbers filled with various materials to provide insulation and weather resistance. In England, the infill material was typically a combination of woven branches and mud, a technique known as wattle and daub. In New England, where the climate was more severe and certain materials were more readily available than others, the colonists adapted this tradition, eventually settling on a combination of approaches that suited their particular circumstances. The adaptation was not immediate. It happened over time, through the accumulation of experience, through the lessons of cold winters and leaking roofs and drafty walls, through the observation of what worked and what did not, through the gradual refinement of practice in response to reality. The most fundamental architectural decision in New England colonial building was the choice of timber frame construction, and it was really not a choice at all. New England in the 17th century was heavily forested. The forests that the colonists encountered were vast, dense, and filled with trees of enormous size and quality that had not been seen in England for generations. Oak, white pine, chestnut, elm, ash, maple. Trees of enormous size, growing in such abundance that clearing them was as much a challenge as using them.
Timber, in other words, was the most available building material in the New World. Stone was present but required labor to quarry. Brick required clay and skilled makers and fuel for kilns. Timber required only the labor of felling and shaping, and those were labors that any able-bodied settler could perform with tools they already owned. The timber frame became the structural skeleton of virtually every house built in colonial New England for the better part of a century. But timber frame construction, however practical its logic, presented challenges that the English tradition had not fully prepared the colonists to address in this new climate. The primary challenge was insulation. A timber frame by itself is not insulated. The spaces between the structural members must be filled with something that prevents cold air from penetrating the interior. In the relatively mild English climate, the traditional solutions were adequate. In New England winters, they were not. The colonists experimented. They tried wattle and daub in the English manner and found it insufficient. They tried various combinations of clay and straw and wood chips. They eventually arrived at a preference for riven boards, thin wooden planks split along the grain of the wood rather than sawn across it, which were more resistant to water penetration and provided better insulation than the English infill materials. But the real innovation, the solution that would define New England colonial architecture for generations, was the exterior sheathing of wooden shingles or clapboards that became the characteristic surface of the New England house. The clapboard, in its simplest form, is a thin, tapered wooden board applied horizontally to the exterior of a house, with each board overlapping the one below it, so that rainwater and melting snow run down the surface and away from the wall rather than penetrating it. The principle is not complicated, but the execution of it across the exterior of a house designed to shed water in every condition that a New England winter could produce required a degree of care and precision that elevated it from a simple practical measure to something approaching a craft. The shingles that covered the roofs of New England colonial houses were made from white cedar or eastern white pine, woods that were naturally resistant to rot and that split cleanly along the grain into thin, flat pieces. A skilled shingle maker could split hundreds of shingles in a day from the right timber, each one tapered from thick at the butt to thin at the top, designed to lie flat against the roof surface and against each other in overlapping courses that presented no opening through which water could find its way. Over time, the exterior of a New England house, both walls and roof, would weather to a silver gray, the natural color of aged cedar and pine that gave the buildings their characteristic appearance. The color was not chosen, it was arrived at. It was the color of wood that had survived many winters, and it became, in the eyes of people who knew what that survival required, a kind of beauty.
The landscape these houses stood in was not a neutral backdrop, it was a participant. The forests provided timber, but also fuel and the raw materials for 100 domestic necessities. The fields that the colonists cleared from those forests were stony and difficult, but capable, with labor, of producing the grain and vegetables and hay that kept families and livestock alive through the winter. And the rivers and streams provided water and, in time, the power to run mills that ground grain and sawed timber. And the hills, the particular rolling topography of New England, with its exposed ridges and its sheltered valleys, were a factor that no house builder could ignore. A house built on an exposed hillside faced the full force of the winter wind. A house built in a sheltered hollow was protected from the worst of it, but vulnerable to the cold air that settled in low places on still nights. The siting of a house, the choice of exactly where on a piece of land it should stand, was not an aesthetic decision in the colonial period. It was a survival decision. And the people who made it well, who read the landscape with the attention it deserved and placed their houses where the land itself offered some protection from the elements, gave their families an advantage that was measured not in comfort, but in the difference between a bearable winter and a dangerous one.
There is a shape that appears again and again across the landscape of colonial New England. You have seen it without perhaps knowing what you were seeing. A roofline that descends steeply at the back of a house, dropping much lower than the front, creating a profile that is asymmetrical and oddly satisfying, like something that grew rather than something that was designed. The ridge of the roof sits well forward of the center of the house. The front face rises 2 full stories to meet it. The back slopes down to a rear wall that may be only a single story high, or sometimes less. This is the salt box, and it is one of the most distinctly New England forms in the entire history of American domestic architecture. The name comes from the wooden boxes that colonial households kept salt in, which had a similarly asymmetrical lid hinged at the back and sloping down toward the front. Someone, at some point in the 17th or 18th century, looked at a house with that distinctive roofline and thought of those salt boxes, and the name stuck with the particular permanence that good names tend to have. But the salt box was not designed to look like anything. It was not designed at all, in the intentional sense of the word. It was the result of a very specific and very practical sequence of decisions made by families who needed more space than their original house provided, and who found in the particular logic of timber frame construction and steep New England rooflines a way to add that space without starting over. The original New England colonial house, in its simplest form, was a single room on each of 2 floors, built around a massive central chimney. It was small by any modern standard. The ground floor room served as the primary living and working space for the family. The upper floor provided sleeping space. The chimney, which we will come to in more detail shortly, was the thermal heart of the entire structure. As families grew, as prosperity increased, as the initial desperate urgency of establishing a foothold in a new land gave way to the longer-term project of building a life, the pressure to expand the house grew with it. A second room was added to the ground floor, mirroring the first on the other side of the central chimney. Then, perhaps, a third, extending toward the rear. But adding rooms to the rear of a timber frame house presented a challenge. The existing roof had to be extended to cover the new addition, and extending a steeply pitched roof toward the back meant that the rear slope of the roof descended rapidly toward the ground. The result, when the extension was substantial, was that distinctive asymmetrical profile, the long rear slope of the roof nearly reaching the ground, sheltering the new addition beneath it, like a wing drawn over something small and in need of protection. The practical consequence of this shape was remarkable. The long rear slope of the salt box roof created a sheltered zone along the back of the house, a space where firewood could be stored, where tools could be kept, where small domestic tasks could be performed out of the weather. In a climate where staying dry and sheltered was a constant preoccupation, this unintentional gift of covered outdoor space was not lost on the people who lived in these houses. The salt box became, over time, a recognized form, something that builders understood and could reproduce intentionally rather than simply arriving at accidentally. But its origins were always in necessity, in the specific pressures of a growing family in a cold climate working within the constraints of a particular building tradition. The Cape Cod house is a different kind of solution to a different set of pressures. If the salt box grew, the Cape Cod was designed from the beginning with an understanding of what was needed. It is lower than the salt box, hugging the ground with an instinct that seems almost deliberate, as though the house is aware of the wind and has arranged itself to offer as little resistance to it as possible. The classic Cape Cod is 1.5 stories tall. The lower story is full height, with walls that rise to a normal ceiling. Above that, instead of a full second story with vertical walls, the roof begins almost immediately, so that the upper floor is tucked under the roof itself, with sloping ceilings that follow the pitch of the rafters. Dormers, small windows that project from the roof slope, bring light and air into the upper rooms. The effect of this form, from the outside, is of a house that sits low and wide on its site, presenting a relatively small surface area to the wind and weather. The long rear roof sheds snow quickly. The low profile reduces the area of exterior wall exposed to the cold. The thick walls, typically filled with a combination of insulating materials that colonial builders had learned over generations of trial and error to be most effective, held the heat generated by the central fireplace against the cold outside. The Cape Cod became, over time, a recognized form, something that builders understood and could reproduce intentionally rather than simply arriving at accidentally. But its origins were always in necessity, in the specific pressures of a growing family in a cold climate working within the constraints of a particular building tradition. But to understand either the salt box or the Cape Cod, you have to understand the thing that both of them were built around: the central chimney.
In the New England colonial house, the chimney was not a feature. It was not an amenity or an architectural element chosen for its visual effect. It was the reason the house could exist at all in a climate where winter temperatures could drop to 20 or 30 degrees below freezing and where the only source of heat was fire. The chimneys of New England colonial houses were massive. Not massive in the decorative sense, not the kind of oversized fireplace that appears in modern houses designed to evoke a vaguely rustic luxury. Massive in the structural sense. A central chimney in a 17th century New England house might measure 6 feet by 8 feet at the base, a solid block of brick or stone that occupied a significant portion of the ground floor plan and extended from the foundation through every floor of the house and well above the roofline. The size was not for show. Every inch of that chimney served a function. The chimney contained not one fireplace, but several, serving multiple rooms on multiple floors from a single massive flue system. The kitchen fireplace was the largest, typically large enough for a person to stand inside, designed to accommodate the heavy iron equipment of colonial cooking and to burn the large logs that provided both cooking heat and warmth for the primary living space. On the opposite side of the chimney from the kitchen, a parlor fireplace provided heat for the formal room where guests were received and where the family gathered for the kind of social and domestic activity that did not belong in the working kitchen. On the floors above, smaller fireplaces served the sleeping chambers, though these were typically used more sparingly than the ground floor fireplaces, since the colonial understanding of sleeping comfort tolerated temperatures that would be considered extreme cold by modern standards. The genius of the central chimney plan was thermal. Stone and brick absorb heat. They absorb it slowly over hours of exposure to fire, and they release it slowly, long after the fire itself has died down. A massive central chimney, surrounded on all sides by the rooms of the house, acted as a thermal battery. The fires burning in its fireplaces throughout the day heated not just the air in the rooms, but the mass of the chimney itself. Through the night, as the fires were banked or allowed to die, the chimney continued to radiate the heat it had stored, keeping the interior temperature from dropping to the dangerous levels that the outside air had reached. This was not a principle that the colonial builders had derived from scientific understanding. They did not know the physics of thermal mass in any formal sense. They knew, from experience and from observation, that a house built around a large central chimney was warmer than a house with smaller chimneys at the ends of the building, that the heat seemed to hold longer, that mornings were less brutal. The end chimney, which became the preferred form in warmer regions of the American colonies, was specifically not suited for New England winters. When the fireplace is located at the end wall of a house, the heat it produces travels across the room toward the center before it reaches the chimney and is lost. Much of the thermal mass of an end chimney is located outside the house envelope, in the portion of the chimney that rises above the roof, where it does not contribute to heating the interior, but does provide a pathway for cold outside air to penetrate the chimney system. The central chimney solved both problems. Its thermal mass was entirely within the house envelope. Every surface of it was surrounded by interior space, radiating heat inward rather than outward. The arrangement was so effective that it became the organizing principle around which the entire floor plan of the New England colonial house was arranged. The floor plan that resulted from the central chimney was remarkably consistent across a wide range of colonial New England houses. Entering the house through the front door, you stepped into a narrow entry space, not a room, but a transitional passage, just wide enough to accommodate a person removing a heavy winter coat. To your left was the hall, the primary room of the house, which in 17th century usage of the word meant not a passage, but a room, the main living and working space of the family. To your right was the parlor, a slightly more formal space reserved for receiving visitors and for family occasions that required a degree of separation from the daily domestic activity of the hall. On the floors above, smaller fireplaces served the sleeping chambers, though these were typically used more sparingly than the ground floor fireplaces, since the colonial understanding of sleeping comfort tolerated temperatures that would be considered extreme cold by modern standards. This arrangement was replicated in house after house across the New England colonies. It was not imposed by any authority or prescribed by any code. It was arrived at independently by builders working with the same materials, the same climate, and the same functional requirements, converging on the same solution because the logic of the situation pointed clearly toward it.
There is a timber in the attic of a house in Ipswich, Massachusetts, that was cut from a white oak tree sometime around 1640. It is still there, still doing the work it was put there to do, still bearing the weight of the roof above it and the floors below it, still jointed at its ends in the mortise and tenon connections that a carpenter made with hand tools in a time before the American Revolution, before the Constitution, before almost everything that most people think of when they think of American history. The timber is not remarkable in any obvious way. It is not beautiful. It is dark with age, slightly irregular in its dimensions because it was shaped by hand rather than by machine, marked here and there by the adze strokes that gave it its roughly rectangular profile. It smells faintly of the centuries it has been accumulating. What is remarkable about it is simply that it is there, that the decisions made in selecting it, cutting it, shaping it, joining it, and placing it in that particular position in that particular structure were good enough decisions that the timber is still doing its job nearly 400 years later. That durability was not accidental. It was the product of a deep and practical knowledge of wood, of its properties and its limitations, of how to work with it and how not to work against it, that the craftsmen of colonial New England possessed in a way that almost no one possesses today. The selection of timber for a colonial house was itself a skilled and consequential task. Not all wood is the same. Different species have different properties, different strengths and weaknesses, different responses to moisture and temperature, and the particular stresses of structural use.
The craftsmen who selected timber for colonial buildings understood these differences, not from any formal training, but from long experience with the materials they worked with every day. White oak was the preferred structural timber for the heaviest members of the frame. It is dense and strong, resistant to compression and to the kind of slow deformation under load that engineers call creep. It is also, crucially, resistant to rot, particularly in conditions where it is alternately wet and dry, which describes the conditions that the lower portions of a timber frame house experience through a New England year of wet springs and dry summers and damp falls. Eastern white pine was the preferred material for boards and planks, for the wide floorboards that colonial houses are known for the interior sheathing that lined the walls and ceilings of the better rooms, for the exterior clapboards that protected the frame from the weather. Pine is soft and easy to work, takes a plane smoothly, accepts paint and finish readily. Its softness is a limitation in structural applications, but an advantage in the surfaces that people live with every day. Chestnut, before the blight that effectively eliminated it from the American forest in the early 20th century, was another valued structural timber, lighter than oak but nearly as strong, resistant to rot, and with a straight grain that made it easy to split and shape. Chestnut was used extensively in colonial New England for the lighter members of timber frames, for roof rafters and floor joists, and the secondary structure that connected the major timbers. Cedar, particularly Atlantic white cedar, was the material of choice for shingles. Its natural oils made it resistant to decay even in the persistently damp conditions of a roof surface, and its grain was straight and even enough to split cleanly into thin, flat pieces that could be laid in overlapping courses to shed water with complete reliability. The timber frame itself was not assembled on site in the way that modern wood frame construction is assembled. Modern light frame construction, the 2x4 stud framing that underlies virtually every house built in America today, is erected piece by piece on site, with each small member nailed in place as the frame rises. The individual pieces are small enough to be handled by a single worker, and the structure grows incrementally from foundation to roof. Colonial timber frame construction worked differently. The frame was assembled not from many small pieces, but from a relatively small number of very large ones. The major timbers of a colonial house might be 12 inches square or larger, and might span 20 feet or more from one support to the next. These were not pieces that a single worker could move or position. They required coordinated effort, specialized equipment, and the kind of organized labor that a single family could not provide on its own. The solution was the raising. A timber frame raising was a community event. When a family had prepared the timbers for a new house, had mortised and tenoned the joints, and laid out all the pieces in the correct sequence on the ground near the building site, they called on their neighbors. Everyone came, men to handle the heavy timbers, to operate the pike poles and ropes that would lift the assembled wall frames into position, to drive the wooden pegs that locked the joints together once they were aligned, women to provide the food and drink that sustained the labor through what might be a full day of heavy physical work. The raising of a timber frame was accomplished in a specific sequence. The major wall frames, called bents, were assembled flat on the ground first, each one consisting of the vertical posts and horizontal girts that would form one cross-section of the house. Once a bent was assembled and its joints fitted and pegged, the whole assembly was raised upright by the combined effort of the work party, steadied with pike poles as it came vertical, and held in position while the longitudinal timbers that connected it to the adjacent bent were fitted and pegged into place. A house frame might be fully erected in a single day, the entire skeleton of the structure rising from a pile of timbers on the ground to a standing frame by evening, ready to receive its roof and walls. The efficiency of this process was remarkable, made possible by the careful preparation of the individual pieces beforehand and by the organized application of collective labor at the critical moment. The joints that held the timber frame together were among the most sophisticated elements of colonial building craft. The mortise and tenon joint, in its simplest form, consists of a projecting tongue of wood, the tenon, cut at the end of one timber, fitting into a corresponding rectangular pocket, the mortise, cut into the face of another. When the tenon is fitted into the mortise and a wooden peg is driven through holes bored through both pieces, the joint becomes rigid and essentially permanent. This description makes the joint sound simple, and in principle it is, but the quality of a mortise and tenon joint depends entirely on the precision with which its two components are made.
A tenon that fits its mortise too loosely will allow the joint to rack under load, the timbers shifting slightly relative to each other in ways that accumulate over time into visible distortion and eventual failure. A tenon that fits too tightly will resist assembly, making the raising difficult or impossible. The ideal fit is one that allows the tenon to slide into the mortise with firm hand pressure, neither loose nor bound, engaging over its full bearing surface with the timber walls of the mortise. Achieving this fit consistently in timber cut with hand tools and shaped by hand labor required a level of skill that took years of apprenticeship to develop. The colonial carpenter who could cut a mortise and tenon joint that fit correctly in timber of variable grain and texture, working with the tools and techniques available in 17th century New England, was a craftsman in the fullest sense of the word. The wooden pegs that secured the joints, called trunnels from the word tree nails, were made from dense, dry hardwood, typically oak or locust. They were driven into holes bored through the assembled joint with a heavy mallet, and as the wood of the timbers dried and shrank slightly over the years following construction, the trunnels tightened in their holes rather than loosening, creating a joint that became more secure with age rather than less. The roofing of the colonial New England house was as carefully considered as its frame. The steep pitch that characterizes colonial New England roofs, typically at an angle of 45 degrees or steeper, was not an aesthetic choice. It was a response to snow. A roof pitched at 45 degrees sheds snow more readily than a shallower roof, because the weight of accumulating snow eventually overcomes the friction between the snow and the roof surface, and the whole mass slides off. A shallow roof holds snow, and snow held on a roof exerts a load that the structure must be designed to bear, or that will eventually cause damage or collapse. The steep pitch also shed rain more efficiently, reducing the time that any given point on the roof surface was in contact with standing water. Given the imperfect water resistance of even the best cedar shingles, reducing exposure time reduced the risk of water penetration. The shingles themselves were laid in overlapping courses, each course covering the upper half of the course below it, so that water running down the roof surface had to traverse at least 2 shingle thicknesses before it could find any gap through which it might penetrate. The butt ends of the shingles, the thick lower edges where the overlapping courses produced a slight step in the roof surface, were positioned to direct water away from rather than toward the underlying structure. The spacing between the rafters and the spacing between the horizontal boards that the shingles were nailed to was calculated to provide adequate support for the shingles without wasting material. In a time when every board had to be sawn or split by hand from timber that had to be felled and hauled to the site, the economy of material was not a minor consideration. Colonial builders used what they needed and not more, because more was expensive in labor and time as well as in material. The walls of colonial New England houses were, by the standards of their time, well insulated. Not by the standards of modern construction, which achieves levels of thermal resistance that would have been incomprehensible to a 17th century builder, but by the standards of what was available and achievable with the materials and techniques of the period. The walls of a well-built colonial house provided a meaningful barrier between the cold outside and the fire-warmed interior. The typical wall construction consisted of the structural timbers of the frame, with the spaces between them filled with a combination of materials.
In the earliest houses, the infill was often a form of nogging, a mixture of brick fragments, clay, and straw pressed into the spaces between the timbers. This was heavy and provided some insulation, but was vulnerable to cracking as the timbers moved seasonally with changes in moisture content. Later practice moved toward the use of riven boards as interior sheathing, applied diagonally to the faces of the structural timbers to provide both weather resistance and the structural bracing that prevented the frame from racking in high winds. Over this interior sheathing, the plaster that finished the interior walls of the better rooms was applied in multiple coats, each one contributing a small additional increment of insulation and, more importantly, sealing the wall surface against the infiltration of cold outside air. It was infiltration, the movement of cold air through gaps and cracks in the building envelope, rather than conduction through the wall materials themselves, that was the primary mechanism of heat loss in a colonial house. A wall that was tight, that had no gaps through which outside air could enter, was a warm wall, even if its insulative value in the technical sense was modest. The caulking of gaps, the careful fitting of window frames and door frames, the attention to every joint and junction in the building envelope was consequently a maintenance task of considerable importance in colonial households. Each fall, before the cold arrived in earnest, the gaps that had opened during the summer's drying were attended to, stuffed with whatever materials came to hand, rags or moss or wood shavings or oakum, to prepare the house for the months ahead.
There is a window in a colonial house in Deerfield, Massachusetts that measures 11 inches wide and 14 inches tall. 11 inches wide, 14 inches tall. It is barely larger than a piece of paper. Standing in front of it, you have to lean down slightly to see through it, and what you see through it is a narrow slice of the world outside, a piece of sky, a portion of the field beyond, framed so tightly that the view seems almost like a painting rather than an opening. That window was not a failure of ambition. It was not the result of poverty or the inability to obtain glass in a larger size. It was a calculated decision made by someone who understood precisely what a window costs in a New England winter, and who had decided, with clear eyes and a practical mind, exactly how much of that cost was worth paying in exchange for the light and the view that the window provided. A window is a hole in a wall, and a hole in a wall, in a climate where the difference between the inside and outside temperature might be 60 or 70 degrees on a January night, is a place where heat escapes. The larger the hole, the more heat escapes. Glass, even the best glass available in the 17th century, is a far worse insulator than a solid wood or plaster wall. Every square inch of glazed window in a colonial house was a square inch of wall that was allowing the heat generated by the fireplaces to leak out into the winter night. The size of colonial windows was a direct expression of this calculation. The glass available to colonial New England builders was not the flat, clear, uniform sheet glass that we take for granted today. Modern float glass, the type used in virtually all contemporary windows, is made by floating molten glass on a bed of molten tin, producing a perfectly flat, perfectly clear surface of whatever thickness is required. It was not invented until 1959. The glass available to colonial craftsmen was produced by entirely different methods, each of which produced a material with its own particular characteristics and limitations. Crown glass, the most common type used in early colonial windows, was made by blowing a gather of molten glass into a large bubble, then cutting the bubble open and spinning it rapidly while it was still hot and plastic, causing centrifugal force to spread it into a flat disc. The resulting disc was thicker at the edges and thinner near the center, and its surface was not perfectly flat, but had a slight undulation that gave it the characteristic distortion that you can still see in the surviving original windows of colonial houses. The disc of crown glass, once cooled, was cut into the small panes that colonial windows were glazed with. The panes had to be small because the disc was limited in size and because the glass became increasingly uneven toward its edges. These small diamond-shaped or rectangular panes that fill the window sashes of colonial houses are not a decorative choice.
They are the natural consequence of the material available to make them. These small panes were set in frames of lead, the familiar leaded glazing of the earliest colonial windows, held together by the soft metal strips called cames that could accommodate the slight variations in thickness and size that individual panes of crown glass always exhibited. The lead was flexible enough to allow a degree of movement as the frame expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and it was workable enough to be shaped around panes of irregular size without cracking them. The wooden window sashes that replaced leaded glazing as colonial building practice matured were themselves a significant technological development. A window sash is the wooden frame that holds the glass panes within a window opening. In the earliest colonial houses, the window opening was simply a hole in the wall fitted with shutters, wooden panels that could be closed to keep out cold and weather when light was not needed, and opened to admit it when it was. Glass was scarce and expensive, and not every window in the earliest houses was glazed at all. As glass became more available and as the economic circumstances of New England settlers improved, glazed windows became standard, and the wooden sash that held the glass became a refined and standardized element of colonial building practice. The double-hung sash window, in which two sashes slide vertically in a frame and can be positioned to ventilate from the top, the bottom, or both, became the dominant window type in colonial New England and remained so for centuries. The construction of a good window sash required careful joinery. The individual panes of glass were held in the sash by thin strips of wood called glazing bars, which had to be shaped with a molding plane to produce the characteristic profile that directed water away from the glass and gave the window its visual character. The corners of the sash were joined with small mortise and tenon joints that had to be precisely fitted to prevent the sash from racking out of square, which would cause the glass panes to crack. The fit of the sash within its frame was critical. A sash that fit too tightly would bind as the wood swelled in wet weather. A sash that fit too loosely would rattle in the wind and allow cold air to infiltrate around its edges. The ideal was a fit that moved freely in dry weather and snugly in wet, a balance that required the carpenter to understand how the specific wood he was working with would move with changes in moisture content.
The doors of colonial New England houses were objects of considerable craft and, in the better houses, of considerable beauty. The front door of a colonial house was not just a functional barrier between inside and outside. It was also the primary point of first impression, the surface that visitors saw first as they approached the house, the element that announced to the world something about the status and taste of the family within. The simplest colonial doors were made of vertical boards held together by diagonal or horizontal battens on their interior face, a construction method that was quick to make, required no specialized joinery, and produced a door that was adequately strong and weather-resistant if its boards were properly fitted and maintained. These batten doors, as they were called, were the standard solution for secondary entrances and for the doors of outbuildings and service spaces throughout the colonial period. The primary entrance doors of better houses were a different matter. The paneled door, in which a frame of stiles and rails encloses raised or recessed panels of thinner wood, was the mark of a house whose owner had the means and the desire to express something beyond mere function at the threshold. The paneled door required skilled carpentry. The frame members had to be mortised and tenoned together with precision. The panels had to be fitted into grooves in the frame members with enough clearance to allow them to move with seasonal changes in moisture content without splitting or forcing the frame apart. The moldings that defined the edges of the panels had to be cut with planes and shaped with chisels to produce clean, crisp profiles that caught the light in particular ways. A well-made paneled door from the colonial period, examined closely, reveals an understanding of wood movement and joinery that is the product of deep experience with the material. The panels float in their frames rather than being glued or nailed, free to expand and contract with the seasons. The joints at the corners of the frame are tight enough to have held, without failure, for 300 years.
Inside the colonial house, the surfaces that surrounded daily life were as carefully considered as the structure that supported them. The floors of colonial New England houses were made from wide boards of white pine, riven or sawn from the abundant pine forests of the region. The boards were wide, often 12 to 20 inches or more across, because the trees from which they were cut were large enough to produce such boards, and because wide boards meant fewer boards to install and fewer joints between them where dirt could accumulate and cold air could infiltrate. The boards were not finished in the modern sense of the word. They were not sanded smooth or coated with the polyurethane finishes that protect modern wood floors. They were planed flat on their top surfaces and fitted together edge to edge, relying on the fit of the joints between them and the natural oils in the pine wood to resist the penetration of water and dirt. Over years of use, the boards developed a patina, a surface quality that reflected the accumulated wax and wear and oil of the lives lived above them, that is recognizable to anyone who has spent time in old New England houses, and that is impossible to replicate artificially. Inside the colonial house, the surfaces that surrounded daily life were as carefully considered as the structure that supported them. The plaster, made from lime, produced by burning oyster shells or limestone, mixed with water and sand and animal hair. The hair, typically from cattle or horses, served as a reinforcing fiber that helped prevent the plaster from cracking as it dried and as the building moved with seasonal changes in temperature and moisture. Plaster was applied in multiple coats. The first coat, called the scratch coat, was applied directly to the lath, thin strips of riven wood nailed horizontally across the wall studs or the faces of the structural timbers, with small gaps between them that allowed the wet plaster to be forced through and to key on to the back of the lath as it set. The scratch coat was deliberately roughened before it dried to provide a mechanical key for the next coat. The finish coat was applied over the scratch coat once it had dried and hardened. In the finest colonial interiors, the finish coat was made from lime putty mixed with fine sand, worked to a smooth surface with a steel trowel. The resulting surface was hard, smooth, and reflective of the firelight that was the primary source of interior illumination in colonial houses. The fireplace surrounds and mantels that framed the openings of colonial fireplaces were among the most elaborately finished elements of colonial interiors. In the earliest and simplest colonial houses, the fireplace opening was framed by nothing more than the exposed masonry of the chimney itself, functional and unadorned. As the prosperity of New England increased through the later 17th and into the 18th century, the fireplace surround became an opportunity for the expression of craft and status that colonial craftsmen and their clients took increasing advantage of. The earliest wooden surrounds were simple, consisting of a flat board across the top of the fireplace opening and vertical boards at the sides, their edges finished with simple molded profiles cut with planes. Over time, these simple elements were elaborated. The mantel shelf appeared, a horizontal surface above the fireplace opening that became a focus for the display of the household's more valued possessions. The surround moldings became more complex, composed of multiple profiles combined to produce the classical vocabulary of ovolo and cavetto and cyma recta that colonial craftsmen derived from the architectural pattern books imported from England. The best colonial fireplace surrounds were built by craftsmen who had internalized these profiles through years of working with the planes and chisels that produced them, and who could lay out and cut a complex molding by eye and by feel without reference to measured drawings that was as clean and crisp as anything that could be produced with modern machinery. That knowledge, held in the hands and the eyes of craftsmen who had spent years developing it, was the invisible material from which colonial New England houses were built. The timber and the glass and the plaster were the visible material. But behind every surface of a well-built colonial house was the accumulated understanding of how to work with those materials, knowledge that had been developed over generations of practice, and that was transmitted not through books or formal instruction, but through the intimate daily experience of making things with the hands.
There is a particular sound that a colonial fireplace makes in the early morning. Not the crackling and popping of an active fire, though that comes later. The sound before that. The sound of someone moving quietly through a cold house in the dark, feeling their way to the hearth, kneeling on the stone in front of the banked coals from the night before, blowing carefully on the gray ash to find the red underneath, feeding small pieces of kindling onto the glow, waiting with the patience of long habit for the flame to catch. That sound and the sequence of actions that produced it was the first task of every morning in a colonial New England household from the first days of settlement until well into the 19th century. Before breakfast could be made, before water could be heated, before any of the warming tasks of the day could begin, the fire had to be re-established. And the fire could only be re-established if it had been properly managed the night before, banked with enough ash and coals to hold a living ember through the cold hours of the night. The management of fire was not a peripheral domestic skill in colonial New England. It was a central one, as fundamental to the survival and functioning of the household as any other task, and it shaped the design of the houses that were built to contain it in ways that reach into every corner of the floor plan, every dimension of the chimney, every detail of the hearth. The kitchen fireplace was the largest and most important fireplace in a colonial house, and understanding it requires a significant adjustment of mental scale. When most people today think of a fireplace, they think of something roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, sized to burn modest logs for the pleasure of the light and warmth it produces in a living room that is heated primarily by other means. The kitchen fireplace of a 17th century New England house was nothing like this. A typical colonial kitchen fireplace was 6 feet wide or wider, with a depth of 2 to 3 feet and a height sufficient to allow a person to stand inside it without stooping. This was not an exaggeration of scale for effect. It was the minimum size required to accommodate the equipment and the fuel loads that cooking and heating demanded. The cooking equipment of a colonial kitchen was heavy and required space. Iron pots of substantial size hung from a horizontal bar of iron called a crane, which was pivoted at one side of the fireplace opening so that the pots could be swung out over the hearth floor for tending and then swung back over the fire. Iron trivets and pot hooks and trammels, adjustable hanging devices that allowed the height of a pot above the fire to be varied, populated the fireplace with a mechanical complexity that the word hearth does not quite suggest. At the back of the fireplace, the bake oven opened through the masonry of the chimney wall, a separate chamber heated by burning a load of wood inside it, raking out the coals and ash once the masonry had absorbed sufficient heat, and then loading the bread or pies or beans that would bake slowly as the oven cooled. The timing and management of a bake oven required experience and judgment that came only from years of practice, a knowledge of how long particular loads of wood burned, how hot the oven needed to be for different foods, how to test the temperature by feel or by the behavior of a handful of flour thrown onto the oven floor. The management of the kitchen fire through a colonial day was a task of continuous attention. The fire itself was never allowed to go entirely out during the months when heat was needed, which in New England was a substantial portion of the year. The labor of relighting a fire from scratch, using flint and steel to strike sparks onto tinder and nursing the fragile flame through kindling to fuel, was significant enough that maintaining a living ember was strongly preferable to starting over from cold. The fire was managed not as a single uniform blaze,
but as a collection of distinct burning conditions suited to different cooking tasks. A hot, fierce fire of dry hardwood was needed for the rapid boiling of water or the quick searing of meat. A slower, steadier fire of larger logs was better for the long simmering of stews and soups that were a staple of colonial cooking. The correct positioning of a pot on its crane, the right selection of wood for the immediate task, the management of the draft through the manipulation of the chimney damper where one existed, were all part of the ongoing work of keeping the kitchen fire doing what was needed of it. The wood that fed these fires was itself the product of substantial labor. A colonial household in New England might burn 20 or 30 cords of wood in a year, each cord representing a stack of 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. The felling of trees, the splitting of logs, the stacking and seasoning of the resulting wood, and the daily carrying of it from the woodpile to the house were tasks that occupied a significant portion of the labor of every colonial household through the warmer months when the wood had to be prepared against the winter's need. The woodshed, that covered storage space attached to or adjacent to the colonial house, was an essential element of the domestic infrastructure, a structure whose size and fullness as winter approached was a direct measure of the household's preparedness for the cold months ahead. A full woodshed in November was a form of security as real and as important as any other form of provision against the season. The arrangement of the colonial house related to the cold was not limited to the design of its walls and windows and chimneys. It extended to the organization of the spaces around the house, to the planning of the dooryard and the outbuildings and the covered passages that connected them, to the entire domestic geography within which the colonial family moved through a winter day.
The connected farm, a building form that became characteristic of rural New England, was the most complete expression of this thinking. In the connected farm, the main house, the kitchenelle, the woodshed, the carriage barn, and the animal barn were linked in a continuous covered sequence so that a family member could move from the warmth of the kitchen to the animal stalls and back without setting foot outdoors. This arrangement was not universal in the colonial period. The connected farm as a fully developed form evolved over the 18th and into the 19th century, reaching its most complete expression in the farms of Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, where the winters were longest and the pressure to minimize outdoor exposure was most acute. But the logic that produced it was present from the beginning of colonial settlement, expressed in the covered entry passages and attached woodsheds and close placement of outbuildings that appear in even the earliest New England farmsteads. The arrangement of outbuildings in relation to the main house reflected a careful reading of the winter wind. The barn, with its large openings and its resident animals and its stores of hay, was typically placed to the north or northwest of the house, where it would intercept the prevailing winter winds before they reached the house. The kitchen garden was to the south, where it would receive the maximum winter sun. The well was close to the kitchen door, minimizing the distance that water had to be carried in the cold. Inside the house, the daily rhythms of colonial life were organized around the fire with a completeness that is difficult to appreciate from the perspective of a world in which heat is available at the turn of a thermostat. The Franklin stove, developed by Benjamin Franklin in 1741, was an early step in this transition. By enclosing the fire in an iron box that radiated heat from all its surfaces rather than only from the open face of a fireplace, the stove dramatically increased the efficiency with which fuel was converted to useful heat. A room heated by a Franklin stove could be kept warm with a fraction of the wood that an open fireplace required for the same effect. But the stove did more than improve efficiency. It changed the relationship between the fire and the room it heated. The open fireplace was not just a heat source, it was a focus, a visual center around which the room was organized, a source of light as well as warmth, a place where the activity of the fire itself, the shifting flames and the glowing coals, provided a kind of companionship in the long winter evenings.
The stove was more efficient and less present. Its heat was better distributed through the room, less concentrated at the hearth, and more available at every point of the interior. But the fire it contained was invisible, enclosed in iron, its light lost, its visual life gone. The room that a stove heated was warmer, but somehow less alive than the room organized around an open fire. This tension between the efficiency of enclosed heating and the social and psychological qualities of open fire is one that has never been fully resolved in American domestic life. The decorative fireplace, installed in houses that are heated by entirely other means, built for its visual and psychological presence rather than for its thermal contribution, is the contemporary expression of a preference that was established in the colonial period, when fire was not a choice but a necessity, and the qualities of its presence were inseparable from the act of staying warm.
There is a moment in the life of a settlement when it stops being a settlement and starts being a civilization. It does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, in the accumulation of small changes that are individually unremarkable, but that collectively represent a shift in the fundamental orientation of a community, a shift from survival to permanence, from making do to making well, from the urgent question of whether the house will keep the cold out to the more leisurely question of whether the house is beautiful. New England reached that moment unevenly and in different places at different times in the early decades of the 18th century. The first generation of settlers had built for survival. Their houses were the product of necessity, shaped by climate and available materials and the hard-won understanding of what it took to keep a family alive through a New England winter. The architectural logic of those houses was a functional logic, every element justified by the work it did, rather than by the appearance it presented. The second and third generations built differently, not because the climate had changed or because the structural challenges of building in New England had become any less demanding, but because the community had accumulated enough prosperity, enough stability, enough confidence in its own permanence to begin asking more of its buildings than mere function. The result was a transformation of New England domestic architecture that unfolded through the 18th century, producing houses that retained the structural logic of the earliest buildings while clothing it in a new language of form and ornament derived from the architectural fashions of Georgian England. The Georgian style takes its name from the 4 King Georges who occupied the English throne from 1714 to 1830. Though the architectural movement it describes was rooted in the classical revival of the late 17th century and the work of architects like Christopher Wren and later James Gibbs and the Earl of Burlington. What the Georgian style brought to English architecture and eventually to colonial New England was a systematic application of classical proportional principles to the design of buildings. The proportions of ancient Greek and Roman architecture, codified and transmitted through the treatises of Renaissance architects like Palladio and Serlio, provided a set of rules for the relationship between architectural elements, between columns and their entablatures, between windows and the walls that contained them, between the height of a room and its width and length, that produced buildings of a particular kind of harmony and order. This was not a purely visual concern. The architects and patrons who embraced the Georgian style believed, with the genuine conviction that the 18th century brought to questions of reason and order, that the proportional system of classical architecture expressed something true about beauty and about the relationship between beauty and reason. A building whose proportions were correct in the classical sense was not merely pleasing to look at, it was right in a deeper sense, aligned with principles that were universal rather than merely fashionable. That conviction may seem remote from the practical concerns of colonial New England builders, but it traveled, carried in the pages of the architectural pattern books that began arriving in New England from England in increasing numbers from the 1720s onward, and it took root in a community that was prosperous enough to care about such things and educated enough to understand them.
The architectural pattern book was the primary vehicle through which the Georgian style reached colonial New England. These books, printed in England and imported to the colonies in significant quantities, contained engravings of buildings and architectural details, accompanied by text explaining the proportional principles that governed their design. They were not working drawings from which buildings could be directly constructed. They were pattern books in the literal sense, providing patterns of form and ornament that skilled craftsmen could adapt to the specific requirements of a particular building in a particular location. The most influential of these books in colonial New England were the works of Batty Langley, whose various publications on practical architecture appeared through the 1720s and 1730s and provided colonial craftsmen with accessible explanations of classical proportional principles and detailed engravings of the architectural elements, doorways, windows, cornices, mantelpieces, that they needed to produce work in the Georgian manner. Abraham Swan, William Halfpenny, and later William Payne produced similar works that circulated widely in colonial New England. The carpenters and joiners who built the Georgian houses of the mid and late 18th century worked from these books, adapting the English models they found in them to the materials and conditions of New England, producing work that was recognizably Georgian in its vocabulary, but distinctly American in its character. The adaptation was not always smooth. The classical proportional system was developed in the context of stone and brick construction, with columns and pilasters and entablatures that derived their proportions from the structural logic of masonry. Translating these forms into wood, the primary material of New England construction, required adjustments that the pattern books did not always provide guidance for. Colonial craftsmen made those adjustments through a combination of careful study, practical experimentation, and the kind of informed improvisation that skilled tradespeople have always applied to the translation of ideal forms into physical reality. The Georgian house in New England was, in its plan and structure, recognizably descended from the colonial houses that preceded it. The central chimney plan persisted, though in the more ambitious Georgian houses, it was sometimes replaced or supplemented by end chimneys, as the increasing prosperity of the period made it possible to maintain fires in more rooms simultaneously. The timber frame remained the structural basis of New England construction through most of the 18th century, though the dimensions of the major timbers became somewhat lighter as builders gained confidence in the structural system, and as the largest and oldest trees, which had provided the massive timbers of the earliest buildings, became less immediately available. What changed was the exterior and interior treatment of the house, the faces that the Georgian house presented to the world and to the people who lived within it. The exterior of a Georgian house in New England was symmetrical in a way that the earlier colonial house had rarely been. The facade was organized around a central axis, with windows placed at regular intervals on either side of the front door, their positions determined by the proportional rules of the style, rather than by the interior arrangement of rooms. The front door itself became a significant architectural element, framed by pilasters and crowned by a pediment or an elaborated transom light that announced the classical pretensions of the house. The windows grew larger.
The small casement windows of the earliest colonial houses, their multiple small panes of crown glass set in lead cames, gave way to the larger double-hung sash windows of the Georgian period, their panes still small by modern standards, but significantly larger than those of the 17th century. The increase in window size reflected both the increasing availability and decreasing cost of glass and the Georgian preference for well-lit interiors that the proportional system demanded. The front door of a Georgian house in New England was one of the period's most characteristic and recognizable features. In the simplest Georgian houses, the front door was framed by flat pilasters on either side and topped by a simple transom light, a small window above the door that admitted light to the entry passage.
In the more elaborate houses of the prosperous merchant and professional families who were the primary clients for Georgian architecture in New England, the doorway became a set piece of architectural display, its pilasters crowned by capitals in one of the classical orders, its entablature carrying a correctly proportioned frieze and cornice, its pediment either triangular in the most severe classical manner or broken and scrolled in the more florid Baroque manner that the Georgian style also accommodated. The doorway was the primary location in the exterior of a New England Georgian house where the skills of the architectural joiner, the craftsman who specialized in the fine woodwork of interior and exterior trim, were most fully displayed. The moldings of a Georgian doorway, cut from wood with a set of specialized hand planes, were complex in their profiles and required precise execution to produce the crisp shadow lines and carefully balanced proportions that gave the best work its quality. These molding profiles were not invented by the craftsmen who executed them. They were derived from the classical vocabulary documented in the pattern books, the ovolo and the cavetto, and the cyma recta and the cyma reversa, profiles with names that trace their lineage back to the treatises of Vitruvius in ancient Rome. But the translation of these profiles from the engravings in a printed book to the actual wood of a door surround in a Massachusetts town required a craftsman who had internalized the proportional principles well enough to adapt them intelligently to the specific scale and material of the work in hand. The interior of the Georgian house underwent a transformation as significant as its exterior. The rooms of the earlier colonial house had been utilitarian spaces, their walls plastered and their woodwork simple, their proportions determined by the structural logic of the frame and the practical requirements of heating and circulation, rather than on any aesthetic system. The rooms of the Georgian house were designed. The ceiling heights of principal rooms increased, responding to the Georgian preference for well-proportioned spaces in which the height of the room bore a specific mathematical relationship to its width and length. The rooms of a modest Georgian house might have ceilings of 8 or 9 feet, compared to the 7 feet or less that was common in earlier colonial houses. In the more ambitious houses of the period, principal rooms might have ceilings of 10 or 11 feet, a height that allowed the full development of the classical cornice, the molded transition between wall and ceiling that was one of the most characteristic elements of Georgian interior design. The fireplace surround in the Georgian interior became an elaborate composition of pilasters and entablature and overmantel, the vertical surface above the mantel shelf that in the grandest Georgian houses rose to the ceiling, filled with paneling or painting or a looking glass that reflected the light of the room and amplified the sense of space and prosperity that the whole composition was designed to project. The staircase, that most technically demanding element of interior joinery, reached a level of elaboration in the Georgian houses of prosperous New England that represented the highest achievement of colonial craftsmanship. The prosperity that made Georgian architecture possible in New England was not evenly distributed. The grand Georgian houses of Portsmouth and Salem and Newport and Boston were built by merchants whose wealth derived from trade, from the complex network of commercial relationships that connected New England to the Caribbean, to England, to the Mediterranean, and to the other colonies. This trade was not innocent. It included, prominently and profitably, the trade in enslaved peoples, and the refined interiors of the finest Georgian houses in New England were furnished and maintained by enslaved workers whose presence in the domestic spaces of colonial New England is written into the historical record, even when it is absent from the architectural histories. The architectural logic of the Georgian house accommodated this reality in its plan. Service spaces, kitchen facilities, storage areas, the spaces where domestic labor was performed, were segregated from the formal spaces of the house in ways that the earlier colonial house, with its single kitchen that was also the primary social space of the household, had not required. The Georgian house, in its separation of the spaces of display from the spaces of work, reflected and reinforced the social hierarchies of the world that produced it. This is part of the architectural logic too, not the logic of climate or structure or material, but the logic of social organization, of the ways in which the physical arrangement of a house expresses and enforces the relationships of the society that builds and inhabits it.
There is a house in Salem, Massachusetts that was designed by a man who had never formally studied architecture in his life. He was a carpenter by trade, the son of a carpenter, trained in the practical craft of building through years of work with his hands and with the tools of his trade. He had read the pattern books that circulated among New England craftsmen of his generation, had studied the engravings of English buildings, and absorbed the proportional principles of the classical tradition as they had been transmitted through those printed pages. And then he did something that the pattern books could not have prepared him to do. He invented, not radically, not in the way that a revolutionary invents by rejecting everything that came before, but in the way that a deeply skilled craftsman invents, by taking what he has absorbed from the tradition and pushing it in a new direction, finding within the established vocabulary a possibility that no one had quite found before. His name was Samuel McIntyre, and the houses he designed in Salem in the last decades of the 18th century and the first years of the 19th are among the most beautiful buildings that New England has ever produced. McIntyre's work represents a particular moment in the history of New England architecture, the moment when the colonial inheritance of English forms began to be transformed into something distinctly American, not by rejection of the past, but by the particular creative pressure of a new nation finding its own voice in the materials and forms it had inherited. The Federal style, which is the architectural term for the period roughly between the end of the American Revolution and the 1830s, takes its name from the new federal government established by the Constitution of 1787. The name is somewhat misleading because the style was not invented in America and was not primarily a product of the political circumstances of the new republic. It derived from the work of the Scottish architect Robert Adam and his brothers, who in the 1760s and 1770s had developed a refined and delicate variant of the classical vocabulary that was quite different in character from the earlier Georgian period. The Adam style, as it was called in England, was characterized by a lightness and elegance that its practitioners derived from their study of ancient Roman interiors, particularly the decorative schemes of Roman houses discovered during the archaeological excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum that were generating enormous excitement among educated Europeans in the mid-18th century. Where the Georgian style had been bold and assertive in its use of classical forms, the Adam style was refined and delicate, its ornamental elements smaller in scale, more intricate in detail, more consciously graceful in their proportions. This refinement traveled to America in the pattern books of William Payne and other English authors, who translated the Adam manner into practical guidance for working craftsmen. It arrived in a new nation that was simultaneously hungry for the cultural legitimacy that association with classical tradition provided, and eager to assert its independence from the English models on which that tradition had been transmitted. The result was a creative tension that produced some of the most interesting architecture in American history. The Federal House in New England was recognizably descended from its Georgian predecessor, but different in ways that went beyond mere fashion. The exterior of a Federal house was more delicate than a Georgian house of equivalent size. The ornamental elements, the doorway surround, the window caps, the cornice at the roofline, were lighter in their proportions, their profiles more attenuated, their details more finely drawn.
Where the Georgian doorway had been a bold classical composition of substantial pilasters and a firmly modeled pediment, the Federal doorway was an exercise in refined elegance, its slender columns supporting an elliptical fanlight of intricate leaded glazing, its sidelights framing the door with thin pilasters of delicate proportion. The elliptical fanlight was perhaps the most characteristic single element of Federal style in New England. The semicircular fanlight had appeared in Georgian buildings, but the Federal period favored the ellipse, a more complex curve that required greater skill to execute in wood and leaded glass, and that produced an effect of particular refinement. The glazing bars of the fanlight were arranged in patterns of radiating lines and delicate tracery that caught the light and cast complex shadows on the wall behind them. These fanlight patterns were not arbitrary decorations. They were geometrical compositions derived from the same proportional principles that governed the larger elements of the building, miniature expressions of the same classical logic at a different scale. A craftsman like McIntyre, who understood those principles, could design a fanlight that was in harmony with the doorway it crowned and the facade that contained it, because all of these elements were expressions of the same underlying system of proportion. The interior of the Federal House was where the style expressed itself most fully and most beautifully. The rooms of the finest Federal houses in New England were decorated with a delicacy and refinement that represented the highest achievement of the American decorative arts tradition. The plaster ceilings were ornamented with applied compositions of classical motifs, swags and urns and paterae and delicate garlands modeled in plaster by craftsmen who had developed a specialized skill in this demanding technique. The walls were paneled or papered, their upper portions finished with a cornice of refined profile that marked the transition to the plastered ceiling above. The fireplace surrounds of the Federal period were transformed by the influence of the Adams style into compositions of considerable elegance. The heavy Balection moldings of the Georgian surround gave way to flat, attenuated pilasters of refined proportion, their shafts decorated with applied ornament of wood or composition.
A material made from chalk and linseed oil and other ingredients that could be pressed into molds to produce intricate decorative elements in quantity and then applied to flat surfaces. The mantel shelf, that horizontal surface above the fireplace opening that had been a feature of Georgian interiors, became in the Federal period a more prominent element of the composition, its frieze decorated with applied ornament, its shelf supported by slender consoles of delicate profile. Above the mantel, the overmantel panel was sometimes filled with a looking-glass in an elaborately carved and gilded frame, reflecting the room and its occupants and multiplying the light of the candles that were the primary source of illumination in evening hours. Samuel McIntyre's contribution to this tradition was a distinctive personal style that drew on all of these sources but transcended them. McIntyre's ornamental vocabulary was derived from the Adam manner as transmitted through the English pattern books, but his execution of that vocabulary had a quality that was entirely his own. His carved ornament, the baskets of fruit and sheaves of wheat and eagles and other motifs that appear on the doorways and mantels and furniture of his Salem commissions, was cut from wood with a precision and vitality that gave it a presence beyond mere decoration. He worked primarily in wood, the material he had mastered through his years as a carpenter, and his understanding of wood, of how to cut with the grain and across it, of how to model a surface in relief with chisels and gouges, of how to achieve smooth transitions between carved elements and the flat surfaces surrounding them, gave his ornamental work a quality that distinguished it from the work of craftsmen who were technically competent but less thoroughly in command of their material.
The houses McIntyre designed for the prosperous merchants of Salem represented the full flowering of Federal style in New England. Their symmetrical facades of red brick, their refined doorways with elliptical fanlights, their interiors of delicate plasterwork and carved wood ornament were expressions of a world that had achieved a remarkable degree of sophistication in a remarkably short time. Salem in the 1990s and early 1800s was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the new United States, its prosperity built on the maritime trade that sent its ships to every ocean. The houses that McIntyre and other craftsmen built for the merchants who commanded that trade were appropriate expressions of the confidence and cultivation that the town's wealth had made possible. The Federal period in New England architecture was also the period in which the professional architect, as distinct from the skilled carpenter-builder, began to establish a presence in American building culture. Charles Bulfinch of Boston was the first native-born American to practice architecture as a profession in the modern sense. Trained not through apprenticeship in a building trade, but through observation and study during a period of travel in England and France, Bulfinch brought to American architecture a breadth of reference and a sophistication of design that was different in kind from the work of even the most skilled craftsman builders of the colonial tradition. Bulfinch's work in Boston, including the Massachusetts State House, completed in 1798, and the numerous residential buildings he designed for the wealthy families of Beacon Hill, established the Federal style in its most accomplished American form, and set a standard against which all subsequent New England architecture was measured. His influence extended beyond his specific buildings. The example of a man who could design buildings as a primary professional activity, drawing on a cultivated knowledge of architectural history and theory, gradually changed the way that building design was understood and practiced in New England. The craftsman-builder who designed from pattern books remained the dominant figure through the Federal period and well into the 19th century. But the existence of professional architects like Bulfinch established a model for architectural practice that would eventually transform the entire culture of building design. The Federal period also saw the emergence of the first distinctly American architectural publications, pattern books written by American authors for American craftsmen working with American materials in American conditions. Asher Benjamin of Greenfield, Massachusetts, published the first edition of his Country Builder's Assistant in 1797, followed by a series of subsequent pattern books that went through numerous editions and were distributed widely throughout New England and beyond.
Benjamin's books were different from their English predecessors in ways that reflected his understanding of the specific conditions of American building practice. His proportional systems were simplified in ways that made them more accessible to craftsmen without formal mathematical training. His ornamental details were adapted to the capabilities of American craftsmen working primarily in wood rather than the stone and plaster of English practice. His instructions were written in plain language that assumed a reader who was a skilled tradesperson rather than a gentleman amateur. The result was a set of publications that genuinely served the needs of the New England building community, providing guidance for the production of Federal-style architecture in a form that craftsmen could actually use, and doing so in terms that acknowledged and respected the particular character of American building practice. Benjamin's books were used. The evidence is in the buildings themselves, in the doorways and mantels and cornices of Federal period houses across New England that can be traced directly to his published designs, adapted and modified by the craftsmen who executed them, but recognizably derived from his plates. The Federal style in New England was substantially the style that Asher Benjamin taught. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Federal period was giving way to new architectural movements
that would carry New England in directions that neither McIntyre nor Bulfinch nor Benjamin had anticipated. The Greek Revival, inspired by the growing scholarly and popular interest in ancient Greek architecture that accompanied the Greek War of Independence and the broader Romantic movement's fascination with the classical past, was beginning to transform American domestic architecture in ways that would be dramatic and far-reaching. But before moving into those later developments, it is worth pausing at the end of the Federal period and observing what had been accomplished in the century and a half of New England building that we have traced from the earliest colonial settlements. A tradition had been established, not the rigid tradition of an official style or a prescribed form, but a living tradition of building practice, rooted in the specific conditions of climate and material and craft that New England presented, refined through generations of practical experience, enriched by the successive influences of Georgian and federal architectural fashion, and producing, by the early 19th century, a built environment of remarkable coherence and quality. The houses of New England, from the simplest Cape Cod to the grandest federal mansion, shared certain qualities that derived from this tradition, a relationship to their sites that reflected long experience with the New England climate, a material character rooted in the timber and masonry of the region, a proportional sensibility that had absorbed the lessons of classical architecture and made them its own, a craft quality that represented the accumulated knowledge of generations of skilled builders. That tradition was the architecture of a place that had learned, slowly and carefully, how to build well in difficult conditions, and its lessons, though the conditions that produced them have been transformed beyond recognition by modern technology, remain visible in the landscapes of New England wherever the old buildings still stand.
There is a moment when a tradition becomes self-conscious, when the people who are part of it stop simply practicing it and begin to think about it, to name it, to study it, to compare it with other traditions from other times and other places, and to ask, sometimes with genuine curiosity and sometimes with the restlessness of people who have been doing the same thing for a long time, whether there might be other ways of doing it. New England architecture reached that moment in the 1820s. The federal style that had produced the refinements of Bulfinch and McIntyre and Asher Benjamin was, by the early decades of the 19th century, beginning to feel like a manner rather than a conviction. Its proportional principles were still sound, its craftsmen were still skilled, but the cultural energy that had driven it, the excitement of a new nation finding an architectural vocabulary adequate to its aspirations, had dissipated somewhat into the comfortable competence of a well-established tradition. And from across the Atlantic, a new enthusiasm was arriving that would displace the federal manner with a different kind of classical aspiration, more ideologically charged, more historically specific, and in some ways more deeply suited to the particular self-image that Americans of the early 19th century were constructing for themselves. The Greek Revival had arrived. The enthusiasm for ancient Greek architecture that swept through educated American culture in the 1820s and 1830s was not primarily an aesthetic phenomenon, it was a political and moral one. The ancient Greeks were understood in the intellectual culture of the early American Republic as the inventors of democracy. Their city-states, particularly Athens in its 5th century BC Golden Age, were seen as the historical precursors of the American experiment in self-government, the models from which the founding generation had drawn inspiration, and to which the new nation was in some sense indebted. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821 and ended with Greek independence from Ottoman rule in 1829, intensified this identification. Americans followed the Greek struggle with enormous sympathy, seeing in it a reflection of their own revolutionary history, a small people fighting for self-determination against a larger imperial power. The cause of Greek independence was the cause of liberty itself,
and the architecture of ancient Greece was the architecture of that cause. Against this backdrop, building in the Greek manner was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a statement of values. A Greek temple-fronted house or public building in a New England town was not simply a building that happened to have classical columns across its facade. It was an assertion of the owner's identification with the principles of democratic self-government that the Greek precedent was understood to embody. The practical expression of the Greek revival in New England domestic architecture was somewhat more modest than its ideological ambitions might suggest. The full temple front, with its colonnade of full-height columns supporting a correctly proportioned entablement and pediment, was reserved primarily for public buildings, banks and courthouses and churches, where the expense and the scale were appropriate to the grandeur of the statement being made. The Greek Revival house in New England was typically a simpler affair, expressing the style through selected elements rather than the full classical composition. The most characteristic feature of the Greek Revival house in New England was the orientation of the gable end toward the street. Earlier New England houses had typically presented their long side to the street, with the ridge of the roof running parallel to the road. The Greek Revival house turned 90 degrees, presenting its gable end to the street so that the triangular form of the gable read as a pediment, suggesting the front of a Greek temple even when no actual columns were present to support it. This reorientation had consequences for the interior plan of the house. The main entrance, which in the earlier orientation had been on the long side of the house, now faced the gable end, requiring a reorganization of the entry sequence and the arrangement of rooms. The stair hall, which in the Federal House had been a central element of the plan, sometimes shifted in importance relative to a new emphasis on the formal parlor rooms that the Greek Revival interior favored. The columns that appeared on Greek Revival houses in New England were most typically found on the front portico, a covered porch supported by columns in the Greek manner that sheltered the front entrance and provided the principal architectural display element of the facade. The columns might be full classical columns with bases and capitals in the Doric or Ionic order, or they might be simplified square piers that suggested columns without fully committing to the classical vocabulary. The craftsmen who built Greek Revival houses in New England had a new set of pattern books to work from. Asher Benjamin, who had done so much to transmit the federal style to American craftsmen, adapted to the new fashion with the practical flexibility of a man whose business was serving the needs of the building community rather than defending the purity of any particular aesthetic position. His later pattern books, beginning with The Practical House Carpenter of 1830, incorporated Greek Revival details alongside the federal forms of his earlier publications, providing craftsmen with guidance for the new style in the same accessible format that had made his earlier books so useful. Minard Lefevre, a New York architect who published several pattern books between the late 1820s and the 1850s, was the other major figure in the transmission of Greek Revival architecture to American craftsmen. His books were more purely devoted to the Greek manner than Benjamin's, and their plates were more elaborate, providing detailed guidance for the complex moldings and ornamental elements of the style.
The ornamental vocabulary of the Greek Revival was different from that of the Federal style in ways that reflect the different character of the ancient Greek and Roman sources on which each drew. Federal ornament, derived ultimately from ancient Roman decorative schemes, was delicate and intricate, composed of small-scale motifs of swags and urns and paterae arranged in refined compositions. Greek ornament was bolder and more geometric, based on the anthemion and the honeysuckle and the meander, forms that had a directness and a clarity that suited the ideological seriousness of the style. The craftsmen who executed Greek Revival ornament in New England wood were working with forms that were in some respects easier to execute than the delicate federal ornament of the preceding generation, because the bolder profiles of Greek moldings were more forgiving of slight imprecisions in their execution.
But the proportional demands of the style were, if anything, more rigorous, because the Greek system of proportion was more absolute and less flexible than the atom manner that federal craftsmen had worked with. The Greek Revival dominated New England domestic architecture through the 1830s and into the 1840s, and then, with a suddenness that reflected the volatile nature of architectural fashion in a period of rapid cultural change, it was displaced. The displacement came from several directions at once, reflecting the broader ferment of the antebellum period in American culture. The Gothic Revival, inspired by the Romantic movement's fascination with the medieval past and given architectural expression by the work of the English architect Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, and in America by the enormously influential writings and designs of Andrew Jackson Downing, offered an alternative to the classical tradition that was emotionally richer and more varied than anything the Greek or Roman vocabulary could provide. Downing's Cottage Residences, published in 1842, and his Architecture of Country Houses, published in 1850, were the most widely read architectural publications in mid-19th century America. They argued with a conviction that resonated deeply with the Romantic sensibility of the period, that architecture should be expressive of character and feeling rather than merely correct in its proportions, that the picturesque qualities of irregular forms and naturalistic ornament were more appropriate to the American landscape and the American character than the severity of the classical tradition. The Gothic cottage that Downing promoted, with its steeply pitched roof and its decorative verge board and its irregular plan that responded to the natural features of its site rather than imposing a symmetrical order on them, was almost the antithesis of the Greek Revival house. Where the Greek house was formal and symmetrical and historically specific in its references, the Gothic cottage was informal and asymmetrical and evocative of a vaguely medieval atmosphere that was more romantic than scholarly. In New England, the reception of these new architectural fashions was complicated by the strength of the regional building tradition. New England had been building in a particular way for 2 centuries by the time the Greek Revival and Gothic Revival arrived. Its craftsmen had developed skills and habits of practice that were rooted in the specific conditions of the region, in its climate and its materials, and its ways of organizing building work. These skills and habits did not simply dissolve in the face of new fashions, however powerful those fashions might be. The Greek Revival house in New England looked somewhat different from the Greek Revival house in the South or the Midwest, because it was built by craftsmen who brought to it the material preferences and constructional habits of the New England tradition. The clapboard exterior that was the characteristic surface of New England houses appeared on New England Greek Revival buildings even when the style, strictly interpreted, would have suggested a smoother, more masonry-like exterior treatment. The steep roof pitch that New England climate demanded persisted even when the Greek manner favored a lower and flatter profile. These adaptations were not failures of understanding. They were the intelligent response of craftsmen who understood both the style they were working in and the conditions they were working in, and who made the adjustments necessary to reconcile the two. The same pattern repeated itself with the Gothic Revival. The Downing cottage in New England was a more robust structure than the same design executed in the milder climate of the Hudson Valley, where Downing himself practiced. Its walls were thicker, its windows smaller, and its ornamental verge board executed in materials that could survive the freezing and thawing cycles of a New England winter, rather than the lighter, more decorative versions that Southern examples sometimes favored.
The Industrial Revolution arrived in New England earlier than in any other region of the country, and its effects on the building trades were profound and far-reaching. The water-powered textile mills that were established in the river valleys of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut in the first decades of the 19th century
were the pioneers of American industrialization. They required the development of new manufacturing techniques, new forms of industrial organization, and new ways of moving goods and people that transformed the entire economy of the region. The building trades felt these changes in several ways. The introduction of the circular saw and later the gang saw in the second and third decades of the 19th century dramatically reduced the cost of sawn lumber, making boards and planks available at prices that transformed the economics of construction. The hand-riving of shingles and boards that had been a significant labor component of colonial construction was gradually replaced by machine-sawn products that were cheaper and more uniform. The balloon frame, developed in the 1830s in the rapidly growing cities of the Midwest, represented the most dramatic transformation of building technology that the industrial period produced. By replacing the heavy timber frame with a system of light, regularly spaced studs of dimension lumber nailed together rather than mortised and tenoned, the balloon frame reduced the skill requirements of basic construction and made possible the rapid, inexpensive building that the growth of American cities demanded. New England was slower than the Midwest to adopt the balloon frame, partly because of the strength of its craft traditions and partly because the heavy timber frame remained a sensible choice for the scale and type of building that the region's building culture emphasized. But by the second half of the 19th century, balloon frame construction was established even in New England, and the craft of the timber framer, with its mortised joints and its trunnels and its community raisings, was becoming a memory rather than a living practice. The last decades of the 19th century brought to New England architecture a period of stylistic experimentation that reflected the broader cultural ferment of the Gilded Age. The stick style, the Queen Anne, the shingle style, the Romanesque revival of H. Richardson, these successive fashions produced buildings of great variety and considerable beauty across the New England landscape. The shingle style, in particular, developed in the coastal communities of Rhode Island and Massachusetts in the 1870s and 1880s, drew on the material character of the New England tradition, on the cedar shingles that had always been a characteristic surface of New England buildings, and combined it with the spatial freedom and picturesque massing of the late Victorian period to produce an architecture that was genuinely regional in a new way. The houses that Stanford White and McKim, Mead, and White and other architects of the shingle style designed for the summer residents of Newport and the Cape and the Maine coast were not colonial houses, but they were, in some important sense, New England houses, drawing on the same material palette and the same relationship to the landscape that had always characterized building in the region. That continuity, running beneath the succession of styles and fashions that the 19th century had brought, was the deepest expression of the architectural logic we have been tracing through these chapters. The logic was not a style, it was a set of relationships between building and climate, between structure and material, between the demands of daily life and the forms that house them. Those relationships had been established in the 17th century by people who were simply trying to stay alive in a difficult place, and they had been elaborated and refined and sometimes obscured, but never entirely lost through the 2 centuries of building that followed. There is a particular kind of longing that a society feels when it has changed faster than it can fully absorb. Not the longing for any specific thing that has been lost, not the precise wish to return to a particular moment or a particular set of conditions, but a more diffuse feeling, compounded of unease at the speed of change and uncertainty about where the change is leading, that expresses itself as a generalized nostalgia for something older and simpler and more rooted than the present moment feels. America felt that longing in the final decades of the 19th century with particular intensity. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the country in the space of a single generation from a predominantly rural agricultural society into an increasingly urban and industrial one. The cities were growing at a pace that overwhelmed the capacity of existing institutions to absorb the growth. The countryside was emptying as the economic logic of industrial capitalism drew workers off farms and into factories. The immigrant populations that the industrial economy required were arriving in numbers that were changing the ethnic and cultural character of established communities in ways that older residents found deeply disorienting. Against this backdrop of rapid and unsettling change, the past became a resource of a particular kind, not something to be preserved as it was, because it could not be preserved as it was. The world that had produced it was gone beyond recovery, but something to be interpreted and selectively retrieved, to be used as a source of values and forms and materials that could anchor the present to something more stable and more rooted than the industrial moment seemed to offer. The colonial revival was the architectural expression of this longing. The moment that historians conventionally identify as the beginning of the colonial revival is the Centennial Exhibition held in Philadelphia in 1876. The exhibition was a celebration of the nation's 100th birthday, a vast display of American industrial and cultural achievement that drew millions of visitors from across the country and the world. Among its many exhibits was a collection of period rooms assembled to represent the domestic life of colonial America, furnished with antiques and reproductions, staffed by women in period costume, demonstrating the crafts and domestic activities of the colonial household. The response of the exhibition's visitors to these colonial rooms was striking. In the midst of an exhibition that was primarily devoted to celebrating the achievements of industrial modernity, the colonial rooms attracted enormous crowds and generated a depth of emotional response that surprised the exhibition's organizers. People stood in front of the recreated colonial hearths and looked at the old furniture and the familiar crafts with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere historical interest. They were looking at something that felt, in the context of the industrial present, like home. Not their literal home. Most of the people looking at these rooms had never lived in a colonial house or engaged in colonial domestic crafts, but something in the forms and the materials and the spatial quality of those recreated colonial interiors resonated with a sense of belonging and rootedness that the industrial city had not yet found a way to provide. The colonial revival that followed from this moment was not a simple matter of copying colonial buildings. It was a complex cultural project of interpretation and selective appropriation, drawing on the forms of the colonial past to address the needs and anxieties of the industrial present. The architects who took up the colonial revival in the 1870s and 1880s were among the most talented of their generation. Charles Follen McKim, William Meade, and Stanford White, the partners of the firm that would become the most influential architectural practice in late 19th century America, were deeply engaged with the colonial tradition from the beginning of their careers. Their early work included careful measured drawings of colonial buildings in New England, a direct engagement with the actual physical evidence of the tradition that they were drawing on, that gave their colonial revival work a specificity and accuracy that distinguished it from the more casual historicism of less careful practitioners. Their 1879 summer tour of New England, during which they measured and documented colonial buildings from Rhode Island to New Hampshire, was a formative experience that shaped the direction of their practice for the following decade. The buildings they studied were not the grandest colonial monuments, but the ordinary fabric of colonial New England, the farmhouses and village churches and town halls that constituted the everyday built environment of the region. What they found in these buildings, beneath the surface variety of individual examples, was a consistency of principle that they recognized as something more than mere convention. The relationship between mass and opening, between solid wall and window, between the scale of ornamental elements and the buildings they adorned. The proportional sensibility that governed these relationships had the quality of a natural law rather than an arbitrary fashion. It worked because it responded, as we have seen throughout this history, to real conditions of climate and material and human use. The colonial revival that McKim, Mead, and White produced in the 1880s and 1890s drew on this understanding with considerable sophistication. Their Newport Casino of 1880, their Low House in Bristol, Rhode Island of 1887, their numerous summer houses along the New England coast were not archaeological reconstructions of colonial buildings. They were new buildings that used the colonial vocabulary with the freedom and intelligence of architects who understood the principles behind the forms rather than merely copying the forms themselves. The colonial revival reached a broader public through a different channel than the sophisticated work of firms like McKim, Mead, and White. The popular press of the late 19th century, the home magazines and pattern book publishers and mail-order house companies that served the rapidly expanding middle-class market for domestic architecture, translated the colonial revival into a vernacular that ordinary families could aspire to and builders could execute without the involvement of a professional architect.
The colonial revival house, as it appeared in the pages of Ladies' Home Journal and House Beautiful and the Sears Roebuck catalog, was a simplified and domesticated version of the academic colonial revival, its forms regularized and its details standardized to the requirements of mass production and modest budgets. The columned front porch, the double-hung windows with divided lights in the upper sash, the clapboard or shingle exterior, the symmetrical facade organized around a central entrance, these were the elements that defined the popular colonial revival house and distinguished it from the other period styles that competed for middle-class favor in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The appeal of these elements was not merely aesthetic. The colonial revival house offered its middle-class owners a connection to a particular version of American history and American identity that felt especially valuable in a period of rapid immigration and cultural change. The colonial tradition was understood as authentically American in a way that the Italian Renaissance or the French chateau styles, also popular in the period, were not. To build in the colonial manner was to claim a particular relationship to the American past, to align oneself with the founding stock of the nation, to assert a continuity with a tradition that predated the industrial disruptions of the present. This ideological dimension of the colonial revival was not entirely comfortable. The version of American history that the revival invoked was selective and exclusionary in ways that the period did not always acknowledge. The colonial past that the revival celebrated was the past of the English settlers and their descendants, not the past of the enslaved Africans whose labor had built so much of colonial prosperity, not the past of the native peoples whose land had been taken to make the colonial settlements possible. The nostalgia of the colonial revival was, in this sense, a partial nostalgia, a longing for a past that had never been as simple or as innocent as the revival imagined it. The scholarly study of colonial New England architecture, which developed alongside and in some ways inspired the colonial revival, was more rigorous in its engagement with the actual evidence of the buildings than the popular movement it influenced. The architects and historians who measured and documented colonial buildings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were producing a record of the tradition that would prove invaluable as the buildings themselves continued to deteriorate and disappear. The Historic American Buildings Survey, established in 1933 as a Depression-era employment program for architects and draftsmen, created a systematic documentary record of historic American buildings that included extensive coverage of New England colonial examples. The buildings documented in these surveys revealed to those who studied them carefully the complexity and sophistication of the colonial building tradition in ways that the popular colonial revival had not always captured.
The structural ingenuity of the timber frame, the thermal logic of the central chimney plan, the careful calibration of window size to the competing demands of light and heat retention, the craft quality of the joinery and the plasterwork and the carved ornament, these were not simply decorative features to be imitated in simplified form. They were solutions to real problems, expressions of a deep understanding of materials and climate and human need. The architects and historians who understood this were in a position to draw on the colonial tradition in ways that went beyond surface imitation. They could engage with the underlying logic of the tradition, with the principles of site response and material honesty and structural clarity that had produced the colonial forms, and apply those principles to the design of new buildings in new circumstances. The most interesting colonial revival work of the early 20th century was precisely this kind of principled engagement with the tradition, rather than mere stylistic appropriation. The work of the Boston architect Royal Barry Wills, who practiced from the 1920s through the 1950s and specialized in what he called the New England house, was an attempt to apply the spatial qualities and material character of the colonial tradition to the requirements of modern domestic life. His houses were not copies of colonial buildings. They had modern kitchens and modern bathrooms and modern heating systems, but their massing and their proportions and their relationship to their sites drew consciously on the lessons of the colonial tradition, on the ways in which colonial builders had responded to the specific conditions of the New England landscape.
Wills published several books explaining his approach, and his work was widely published in the popular home magazines of the period. His influence on the character of suburban New England housing in the mid-20th century was substantial, helping to establish a version of the colonial tradition as the dominant mode of domestic architecture in a region that was rapidly being transformed by post-war suburban growth. The Cape Cod house, that most enduring of New England colonial forms, experienced its most dramatic period of dissemination in precisely these decades. The post-war suburban developments that spread across the landscape of New England, and indeed across the landscape of the entire country, were filled with simplified versions of the Cape Cod. Their steep roofs and central chimneys and small double-hung windows recognizably derived from the colonial original, even as their construction methods and their relationship to the landscape were utterly different from anything the 17th century builders of the original Cape Cods had imagined. The preservation movement that gathered strength through the first half of the 20th century and accelerated dramatically after the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 represented a different kind of engagement with the colonial architectural legacy. Rather than drawing on the tradition to produce new buildings, the preservation movement focused on the conservation of the original buildings themselves, on the physical fabric of the colonial houses that had survived 3 centuries of New England winters and the various changes of use and ownership that history brings to all buildings. The challenges of preserving colonial buildings were considerable. These were structures built from materials that require ongoing maintenance to remain sound, wood and plaster and masonry that deteriorate steadily if not regularly repaired and protected from moisture. The colonial houses that survived into the 20th century had done so because successive owners had maintained them, had replaced failing timbers and re-roofed with new shingles and repointed deteriorating masonry. Those that had not been maintained had collapsed or been demolished. The preservation of a colonial house in the 20th century required, first, the documentation of what was actually there, the actual physical evidence of the original construction and of the changes that subsequent generations had made. It required then the development of a treatment philosophy that could guide decisions about what to preserve, what to repair, and what, if anything, to restore to an earlier condition. And it required, finally, the craftsmanship to actually carry out the physical work of conservation in ways that respected the original fabric and the techniques that had produced it.
That craftsmanship was increasingly rare. The skills of the colonial carpenter, the ability to read the grain of old timber and repair it in kind, the knowledge of traditional plaster mixes and their application, the understanding of how colonial windows and doors were made and how they could be repaired rather than replaced, were skills that had been substantially lost during the century of industrialization that had substituted machine-made products for handmade ones throughout the building trades. The effort to recover and transmit these skills through apprenticeship programs and craft schools and the patient work of individual preservation craftspeople who had dedicated their careers to understanding the old techniques was one of the most important contributions that the preservation movement made to the ongoing life of the colonial tradition.
There is a house in Vermont that has been standing since 1743. It has survived 47 presidential administrations. It has survived the Revolution and the Civil War and 2 world wars and the complete transformation of the American economy from something that its builders would have recognized into something that would be entirely incomprehensible to them. It has survived the replacement of the forest that once surrounded it with fields and the gradual return of those fields to forest as the farms that cleared them were abandoned across the 19th and 20th centuries. It has survived because the people who built it understood something that is very difficult to teach and very easy to forget. They understood that a building is not a product. It is not something that is made, used, and discarded when a newer version becomes available. It is a relationship between a specific place and the climate that acts on it, between the materials available in that place and the human knowledge required to work them, between the needs of the people who will inhabit the building and the forms that can most honestly and most durably address those needs. That understanding is what we have been tracing through these 10 parts. Not a style, not a fashion, not a set of forms that can be borrowed and applied to any situation regardless of its specific character, but a way of thinking about building that begins with attention to reality, to the actual conditions of a place and a climate and a set of available materials, and derives its forms from that attention rather than imposing forms on it from outside. The colonial builders of New England did not think of themselves as architects. They thought of themselves as people who needed shelter and who were going to build it from the materials that were available to them in the place where they found themselves. The architectural logic we have been studying was not a conscious program. It was the accumulated result of thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of individual people in response to the specific pressures of their specific situations. A family in 1650 deciding how large to make their windows was not making an aesthetic decision. They were solving a problem. How much light do we need to live and work comfortably inside this house? How much heat are we willing to lose through the glass in order to obtain that light? The window that resulted from that calculation was not designed, it was derived. A carpenter in 1720 deciding how steeply to pitch a roof was not expressing a stylistic preference, he was reading the climate. He was applying the knowledge accumulated over 2 or 3 generations of New England winters about how much snow accumulates on roofs of different pitches and what happens when it accumulates too heavily. The roof pitch that resulted from that reading was not fashionable, it was correct. A builder in 1780 deciding where to place the central chimney was not following a convention. He was applying an understanding of thermal physics that he had absorbed through experience, through the observation of how heat moved through the spaces of houses built differently, through the felt knowledge of which houses were warm and which were cold and why. The chimney position that resulted from that understanding was not arbitrary. It was the answer to a question that the climate was asking. What the old houses of New England know, if we are willing to sit with them long enough and pay the kind of attention they reward, is this: every good building is a conversation between human need and natural reality, between what people require in order to live well and what the specific conditions of a specific place make available and possible. That conversation, conducted with honesty and intelligence and skill,
produces forms that are not merely functional, but beautiful, because they have the particular beauty of things that are right, that fit their circumstances with the precision that a hand fits a well-worn tool. The salt box roofline is beautiful because it is the shape that results when a timber frame house is extended toward the rear under the logic of its own structural system, and the shape happens to be one that sheds snow efficiently and creates sheltered outdoor space and expresses with perfect clarity the history of the building's growth.
It was not designed to be beautiful. It became beautiful by being true. The central chimney is beautiful because it occupies the thermal heart of the house and makes that occupation visible. Because its massive presence at the center of the plan declares without apology that warmth is not a luxury but a necessity, and that the structure of the house has been organized around that necessity. It was not designed to be a focal point. It became a focal point by being essential. The small windows of the earliest colonial houses are beautiful because they express with perfect honesty the calculation that produced them, the careful weighing of light against heat, of the desire for connection to the outside world against the requirement to maintain a habitable interior through the winter months. They let in exactly as much light as was worth the cost of letting it in, and not 1 square inch more. That economy is a kind of beauty. The question that the history of New England colonial architecture poses for the present is not a stylistic one. It is not a question of whether we should build with clapboards or with steel and glass, whether we should have central chimneys or radiant floor heating, whether our windows should be small or large. Technology has changed the terms of every one of those decisions in ways that make direct imitation of colonial solutions inappropriate and indeed foolish. The question is whether we are still conducting the conversation, whether the buildings we make are the result of a genuine engagement with the specific conditions of their specific places, with the climate and the topography and the available materials and the actual needs of the people who will inhabit them, or whether they are the application of forms derived from elsewhere, from the catalogs of prefabricated components and the aesthetic fashions disseminated through professional publications and the economic logic of building industries that favor standardization over specificity. The colonial builders of New England had no choice but to conduct the conversation. The consequences of failing to attend to the specific conditions of their situation were immediate and serious. A poorly sited house was cold. A poorly framed house collapsed. A poorly roofed house leaked. The feedback from reality was rapid and unambiguous, and the builders who survived and whose buildings survived were the ones who listened to it. We have insulated ourselves, in the most literal sense, from that feedback. Our buildings can be careless about their relationship to their sites and their climates because mechanical systems will compensate for the carelessness. Our structures can be built from materials that have no particular relationship to the place where they are used because a global supply chain makes any material available anywhere. Our forms can be derived from aesthetic fashion rather than from the logic of the situation, because the consequences of getting the form wrong are now aesthetic rather than physical. The insulation is real, and it has produced genuine benefits. The thermal comfort of modern buildings would be incomprehensible to a 17th century New England farmer. The structural safety of modern construction methods has essentially eliminated the catastrophic failures that were an accepted risk of earlier building practice. But something has been lost in the transaction. What has been lost is the quality that the old houses of New England possess in abundance and that most new buildings possess hardly at all. The quality of belonging. Not belonging in the sentimental sense, not the manufactured nostalgia of a colonial revival facade applied to a structure that has no other connection to the tradition it invokes, but belonging in the deeper sense,
the sense in which a thing fits its context so completely that it seems to have grown from it rather than been placed on it. The old houses of New England belong to New England in that deeper sense. They are made from its materials. They have been shaped by its climate. They express in their forms and their proportions and their relationship to their sites an understanding of this specific place that has been accumulated over centuries and refined through generations of practice. They could not have been built anywhere else because the logic that produced them is the logic of this particular landscape and this particular climate and this particular tradition of working with wood and stone and mortar in the conditions that New England presents. That belonging is what makes them beautiful in the way that they are beautiful. Not the beauty of novelty or cleverness or stylistic fashion, all of which fade quickly, but the beauty of rightness, of fit, of a thing that is exactly what it needs to be in exactly the place where it needs to be. The houses are still there. Not all of them. Many have been lost to fire and to neglect and to the various pressures that have made the old fabric of New England towns so difficult to maintain in a period when the economics of construction strongly favored demolition and replacement over conservation and repair. But enough remain. Enough that you can still drive through the older towns of Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Vermont and Maine and encounter around any corner a house that has been standing since the time when the conversation between human need and natural reality was conducted without the insulating mediation of industrial technology. A house that is gray with age and settled into its site with the ease of something that has been there long enough to belong. A house whose proportions and forms and materials speak quietly and without apology of the specific knowledge of this specific place that produced them. If you stop and look at that house long enough, really look at it, you will begin to see the logic that we have been tracing through these 10 parts. The steep roof that sheds the snow, the small windows that balance light against heat, the massive chimney that anchors the thermal life of the house at its center, the clapboard skin that sheds the rain, the site that makes use of every available natural advantage and wastes none. You will see a building that is the answer to a set of questions that the place itself was asking. And in that answer, arrived at slowly and carefully over generations of patient attention to the reality of where these people found themselves, you will see something that the best buildings of any period and any place share: the willingness to listen to the world before speaking to it, the discipline to let the logic of the situation shape the form rather than imposing a form on the situation, the understanding that beauty, real and lasting beauty, is not added to a building from the outside. It emerges from within, from the honest and intelligent resolution of real problems in real materials in a real place. The old houses of New England knew that. They still know it. And if we are willing to pay attention, they are still teaching it. If this journey through the logic of New England colonial homes has given you something to think about, something to carry with you the next time you find yourself in front of an old house and wondering about the decisions that produced it, then it has done what it set out to do. These stories deserve to be heard. This history deserves to be told, slowly, carefully, with the patience that the subject asks for. If you have listened this far, please take a moment to like this video. Your like helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of slow, careful, deeply considered history. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There are more
journeys like this one ahead, more histories of the quiet and the overlooked, the things that shape the world without announcing themselves, told in the same unhurried way that this one has been told.
And share this video with someone you know who loves old buildings or old stories, or simply the pleasure of learning something true about the world at the pace that real understanding requires. The next journey is already waiting.